Hey everyone, I'm Nick DiMatteo and welcome to week 194 and video episode number 20 of 40, the Thursday throwback track. Every week I take a release from my collection, I discuss it, I give you my take on it, I throw in whatever else I decide, and I talk about how it has influenced my music. This week, classic, New Order, 12-inch single, True Faith, 1963. Released in 1987. I actually had to twist this around a couple times to figure out which side that is, but according to the print here, it looks like this is the right side up, so I'm gonna go with this. It's a leaf falling. The album cover is iconic, the song itself is iconic, and there are so many reasons in general to want to talk about this week. A friend of mine was in a band with many years ago. He's been posting a lot of things recently just for fun, to pass the time and stuff like that. And he relied on a very awesome and awesomely old classic question, which is the either-or question, the rival camps question. It's a question I used to hate, but I actually love now, partly because it's kind of nostalgic, because you rarely ever hear it anymore, as far as I know, but partly because it just illustrates people's passion for music and everything like that. What am I talking about? Many of you who are older than, 4 would, 14 maybe, 24, I don't know, I don't even know, would remember you were either a Beatles fan or a Stones fan. You couldn't be both. In the 60s. In the 70s, you were either, that continued on, but you were either an Elton John fan or a Billy Joel fan. Couldn't be both. In the 80s, was it Prince or MxG? In the 90s, was it Nirvana or Pearl Jam or Biggie or Tupac? In the O's, was it the Strokes or the White Stripes? And there were hundreds, maybe thousands more of those either-or arguments, and those are not fake. I mean, I lived through all of them more or less, and I can tell you that I talked to people during all of those eras that were like, well, if you like this band, you can't like that band. You had to pick a side, essentially. And this band, New Order, falls into that, because if any of you know anything about new wave and classic powerhouse, big new wave bands, the bands that gave new wave its name, even if they weren't the first, they were the biggest. There was a rivalry, quote unquote, in the 80s, where you either could like New Order or Depeche Mode. You couldn't like both. And you probably know where I'm going with this, but being the kind of fan I am, I've always been a person who, yes, I have my kind of favorite, but I like both. I have a tremendous amount of respect for the Stones and like a lot of their songs, even though I'm more of a Beatles fan. I think Elton John is absolutely amazing, even though I'm more of a Billy Joel fan. We'll skip, the other argument for now, for the 80s. I originally was in the Pearl Jam camp, I believe. No, Nirvana camp, right? And then switched to Pearl Jam and then said, screw that, I love them both, and still do. And the list, again, goes on and on. It's one of those kind of false argument kind of things, but it's a false argument that starts discussions, that gets people, talking about their passions and everything like that. And the thing about that with this New Order and Depeche Mode is that they were similar in a lot of ways. Their trajectories were similar from a certain point. Certainly not in the beginning, but they had that, that kind of new wave techno mixed with rock sound. They used some real instruments. They did a lot of programming. Most of their lyrics were negative. Their ambience of the music that they created was both dark and danceable. Kind of had a funkiness to it, British funkiness, let's call it. And they did stress a lot of like kind of dark lyrics, but did it in a way that really kind of made you want to get up and dance. So and yet, anybody who knows both bands knows there are a lot of differences too, But what's great, A, is that the differences make them as great as their similarities, and B, like I like to say about a lot of the artists I talk about, these bands are still around and releasing music. They've both recently released albums that had material that it was as good as some of their oldest material. That often happens with bands that they kind of fall out of the spotlight, and once they kind of get through their growing pains of what do, they try to recapture it, blah, 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 and get back to the essence of just creating the music, they start creating work that's so true to them and true to not just their origins, but where they are today, and that's kind of one of the awesome things about it. Speaking of origins, another great reason to talk about this band, everything comes from something. Origins matter. History matters. And New Order fans, you know where I'm going with this. You know, when you have a frontman who is dynamic but ultimately suicidal, sadly, a couple things could happen. The band could completely fold. It could try to recreate itself in the image of its original, band, or it can evolve into something else. And if any of you know this history, you know that there was a band called Joy Division. His lead singer Ian Curtis sadly, took his own life. And the remaining members of this band decided to continue on and reformed as New Order. And they held on to a good portion of that kind of darkness and certainly the ambient kind of techno post-punk rock sound, but they honed it. They made it more danceable, I guess you can say. Although, listen, Love Will Tear Us Apart, weird song, very dark song, but also does have a great beat. And continued on and on and on, and had some great hits in the 80s, including this song, True Faith, but had, I think, their biggest hit in the early 90s, which is, God, I'm forgetting it right now, but look it up, or maybe I'll post it. Which again, they had a long career, but they stemmed from a type of music that I'm sure many of you have heard if you're listening to this at all, called goth. And yeah, go ahead and argue who's goth, who's not goth, who's pure goth, who's I'm not interested in any of that. If there is some element of ambient darkness in the music with techno in it and rock, it's goth. Okay, it has goth qualities. Let's just say that. Because labels are screw labels. It has goth qualities. You know who else had goth qualities? Bauhaus. They're kind of thought of often as the quintessential goth band. Bela Lugosi's dead. They reformed in the Love and Rockets. Had hits in the 80s. There was a band in the mid-70s called The Easy Cure. Easy Answer. Became The Cure. They started out real goth and... a lot of the band members of the band were like, we want to do more than that. Robert Smith in particular, but other members of the band as well really felt that way, and they became the powerhouse that they still are. Siouxsie and the Banshees, another great goth band. And of course, like I said, Joy Division, morphing into New Order. And what I find interesting about Origins is something that I do in the live gigs that I've been doing on Facebook. It's something that I do for almost all these Thursday throwback tracks. It's what I do a song for Saturday when I'm sharing my songs and going back in time. Is you can find those kind of nuggets of germination, where a band comes from, what they held on to, what they decided was more important to them, and how they used that to move forward and grow into something else. It's interesting to me that, and I'll say this, sort of kind of going back into the whole idea of rivals and what you like better or don't like better. A lot of it has to do with just kind of what are certain, artists' strengths. Like I tend to prefer Elton John's piano playing, but Billy Joel's songs and voice, things like that. And in this case, I tend to prefer Depeche Mode's singing and certain ways that it produces things, but overall the kind of feel and ambience and drive of this combination of dare I say Division, dark lyrics and poppy music, and joy, the joy of creating and the joy of getting people up to dance. New Order kind of wins the day as far as the way something sounds for me. And I think that there have certainly been songs that I've done that have been influenced by both bands, but overall, the stuff that I do that kind of has that danceable quality, there are things in there that are kind of Nine Inch Nails-ish and Fatboy Slim and some of the other stuff and things that have happened since then. But primarily, I would say that kind of like slightly dark, driving, pulsating ambience with rock elements you have to go back to New Order, and you have to go back to, maybe not necessarily a single particular song, but this was a huge one. Click the link and find out more about it. Look it up, find out more about New Order, and see what you think of them. And once you've done that, and as you're listening to this, let's give it a second. Anybody who knows this band and knows this song knows that I am playing side B. Side B has the remix, which I was talking to somebody recently about how remixes are so indicative of their own era that themselves are often even more indicative than the original song, which I find cool. But I picked side B because it has 2 songs and is long enough for me to go on my spiel and talk. This song is 1963, by the way. I honestly didn't know all that much about it until, I read about it recently. Again, look it up. That's not what this particular, podcast thingy video dealio is about. But as you're listening and as you're reading, and please, as always, click the links, read below. Click the link at the bottom as well of a song of mine that's fairly recent that you can clearly hear the New Order influence, called Any Universe. It has that, again, kind of mix of techno and rock and a darkness, but getting you up and dancing, some bright poppy things in there as well. And there are plenty of other songs of mine that have been influenced by New Order. And again, so super happy that they're still out there making their stuff, as I am with Depeche Mode and so many of the artists I talk about. Do you have any experience with post-punk or goth or new wave or techno or beyond that industrial and rave and all of those things that dance music morphed into? Do you remember when you could only like one band or another of any rivalry? Weird one, I'm going to mention it. Don't know if it was real or if it was just my own childhood, but there was a point at which you could either like Kiss or John Cassidy. I don't see how they're both even anywhere near in the same camp, but I'm just throwing that out there as a point of discussion if you want to jump off from there. Because as always, my objective with all of this is to bring music to life and to foster conversation and connection. So thanks again for listening, thanks for watching, thanks for reading, thanks for clicking, thanks for sharing, thanks for subscribing. Tune into my Facebook page so you can see my live gigs. They're happening more and more each week, and they will not stop. I take requests too. I do a whole lot of originals, and I do a whole lot of requests both for originals and covers, and I want you to be a part of it in any way that you can. As always, thank you, and I will talk to you next week.